Genesis chapter 21. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Genesis 20. Sorry. Genesis chapter 20. Genesis chapter 20. Before we get into the chapter, do you mind answering a very simple question? And the question is, what are the things, one of the things that God has promised Abraham up to this point in the text? We've come all the way up to chapter 20. God has met with Abraham several times, and he's promised him at least one thing. What has he promised him?
Many descendants.
Many descendants. Very good. Excellent.
He's going to have a son out of his old age.
He's going to have a son out of his old age. Very good. With Sarah. That's key. That's key.
Though many more.
That's right. Okay. Anything else that God has promised? You don't have to answer, but can you think of anything else that God has promised him?
Land.
Say that again.
Land.
Land, yeah. You have land of your own. Okay. And of course, the key word there is the promise, right? God has made a promise to Abraham. And so far, Abraham still does not have that heir with Sarah. But how has God blessed Abraham so far? Does anything come to mind? Or how has he provided for him or protected him or blessed him so far?
He's got it all. As far as cattle and
He does. Yeah, he is materially wealthy. Very good.
protected him in different situations with the kings and when Sarah was his sister, stuff like that. And that was another promise too. Stacy said land, and that's when he had said he'd bless Abraham and he'd bless those who bless him. That was another promise.
Very good. Yes. And that's a key time that God has protected him. He went into another land. Abraham had this assumption he followed through on. It was not good, and God protected him. Very good.
Also, just God talking to him. That's like a nice thing. I'd like to know for sure that he spoke with him and saw him, and I would think that's a big blessing.
Yeah, that would be really cool
Yes.
if we knew that, you just talk to us and say, hey, I want you to do this.
I agree. Talking to you in a dream, right? Yeah, I'm 100%. Very good. All right. So just want to ask you a few, to answer those few questions, just to see where you are and see as we're tracking along with the story, being able to kind of narrate back some key points. And a few of the key things there is God has made promises to Abraham, and God has kept his word to Abraham. And of course, all of Scripture, if we look at Scripture as here are the promises that God makes, and here are the keeping of God's promises. He is the highest standard of the person who speaks truth and then is truth, but also follows through with it. And if we get in here in chapter 20, since you have helped me kind of go over some of those key things in Abraham's life, remember the previous chapter, Sodom has just been destroyed. Now, Lot was spared, and the text will subtly reveal, and then the New Testament will show us explicitly, Lot was a righteous man, though his soul had been vexed. But, back to the idea of Abraham talking to God, Lot is spared partly because who prayed for Lot? Abraham, right? That, man, what a mystical, wonderful encounter between God and Abraham, where Abraham, I'm going to speak to God now. Please be patient with me. He comes to God with such fear, the proper fear, and yet he makes his request known. And the Sodom is destroyed, which lets us know just how wicked the city of Sodom was. And we see that specific scene where those men show up saying, let us have our way with these men. I mean, the degradation of those cities. And yet Lot is spared, not just because of Abraham, right? Lot has shown, if he is a righteous man, he has that trust in God himself, and yet that chapter is such an argument for us petitioning on behalf of others. And Abraham has this powerful encounter with God. The chapter ends at one of the lowest points for any character in Scripture. I mean, think of the lowest points in some characters' lives in Scripture. Peter denying Christ, it's pretty low. David committing adultery and murder, that's pretty low. And here we have Lot, who has lost everything, and then he is the father's children with his daughters. And then we move into chapter 20, the righteous man. One thing that's going to stand out in this chapter, and it's becoming more and more clear as we go through the book of Genesis, and I see it in the next chapter, the mercy and providence of God will correct all sin, even the sin of the righteous man and the righteous woman. Because we can have the ungodly who do all sorts of evil things and will be judged by God. We have the righteous who have their souls vexed, and they will be judged but protected by God. And then we will have the righteous who will be corrected by God and still shown mercy. So go to chapter 20 here. And Abraham journeyed from thence. He journeys from the land where he was near the region of Sodom. Scholars don't know why he's left. Has he left because of a seasonal change? Has he left because of the destruction of the land? It's not made clear. He journeys thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. I believe this is the area back towards Egypt. I could be mistaken. At any rate, and Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. So here it is again. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, it was common practice in the ancient world that if someone wealthy rolled into your region, because even though we have cities, it's not uncommon for someone to live a nomadic life, such as Abraham. And he moves in. You can imagine, if you've ever been traveling down the highway and you've seen maybe a larger SUV or van that's just, it's got the travel case, it's got the bikes, you can see inside, they're traveling with a lot of stuff. Just extend that. A caravan, right? Abraham travels with a caravan, and he rolls into the region, and Abimelech and his people who keep track of who's entering the land, they see this, and it was common practice then to try to make an alliance. And one of the ways you could make an alliance is you could have an exchange of goods, and unfortunately at that time in the world, women were seen as, in many ways, a good, a property, and you could ensure an allianceship between practicing the what was called as the concubine, right? And so Abimelech takes Sarah, and Abraham lets Sarah go to Abimelech because Abimelech believes that Sarah is Abraham's wife. So here's a fun question. What would a man want to do with a 90-year-old woman? She's 90. Abraham's 100. Here's what some Hebrews have speculated. Now, this is just Hebrew speculation, but in the Jewish tradition, here's what some of their speculation has been. I don't know that this is true. I just think it's interesting to think about. In Jewish scholarship, they speculate that in order for Sarah to have a child, God rejuvenated her body so that she would physically be able to carry the child in her womb, bear the child, and then have the energy to raise the child, knowing that she would have help. But in their theory or in their lore, in rejuvenating her body, it gave her back her youthful appearance. So she looked younger. How young did she look? We don't know. Now that's just part of Hebrew lore. Other scholars have said, even if she is 90 and doesn't look as young as others, it was evident by however Abraham rolls into this place, even if she's his sister and is aged, she is almost the highest relationship of this wealthy man. And what better way to form an alliance with someone than to take into your household someone of their kin? So even if she's aged, Abimelech says, I'll bring her in, make her part of my harem, and things will be all right. Verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, thou art a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Notice the assumption that Abimelech has of a divine being. Now, I don't know who all Abimelech worships as far as his gods, but the text reveals that when God, Jehovah, speaks to him in his dream, Abimelech has no confusion over who this is, and he puts it back to God. Are you going to slay a righteous nation? Are you going to touch me, but are you also going, because if you remove the king of a people, you leave the people in disarray. People have to have a leader. Are you going to judge the people who've done nothing guilty here? It's fascinating that Abimelech, as a human being, has this assumption of a divine being. A divine being should know what's right and wrong and should judge accordingly, and it is wrong to judge a righteous people as if they were unrighteous. And if we're reading the scripture and always bearing in mind that this is God's story, and if we see Christ as much as possible in the text, this should make Christ that much more astounding because he would willingly go to be judged as though he was unrighteous, knowing he was unrighteous. Even though he had the political and social backing to have him put to death, he would do that for us. Why would God die for us? What is man that thou art mindful of us, right? Have we done anything to really earn that kind of propitiation? Not individually, right? As he says as Joe in Joe versus the Volcano says, I'm done with myself. I've looked at myself. There's nothing there. And then nationally, what group of people can ever stand up and claim innocence? Right? There's a lot of talk about certain groups being the most evil. But if you line up all the people in the history of the world, there's not a nation that can stand innocently. And yet God would willingly give himself for all of humanity. There's no greater love than this. Verse 5. Not only does it say, will you slay a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, didn't Abraham tell me that she is my sister? And she, even she herself said, he is my brother. So I was told that they both told me. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. So Abimelech knows, even though we would look at that today and say that's still unethical to be swapping people like this, don't agree with that. Abimelech knows I was doing it under the understanding that this was a man's sister and not his wife. I'm not going to take a man's wife. I'm innocent. Verse 6. And not only am I innocent, they told me, right? They duped me. They have deceived me. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. That's something worth thinking about. The New Testament tells us that God can discern between the thoughts and intents of our heart, right? We can fall back on, well, I said this and I did this, and there's no real evidence of my heart, the integrity of my heart, the motivations of my heart. And yet God can go deeper than all of that. And where we as humans might have to speculate about motivation or might not even know or can even lie to ourselves about our motivations, God can peer into that and know. And so he can look at what Abimelech does and knows in your heart you were doing what was right. Right? You've been fully deceived. So watch what God says. I know that thou did this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore I suffered thee not to touch her. God in his will intervened to keep Abimelech from sleeping with Sarah. Now, how did he do that? I don't know. Was Abimelech too busy? Was Abimelech not feeling well? I have no idea. And yet here we have once again this mystery. It truly is a mystery of how the will of God is still worked, and yet there's still room for the will of man. And we'll see this in just a minute. And yet God will impose his will from time to time, like he will stop the sun if the arms are raised. Like no one's going to keep Christ from dying for humanity. And here, God is going to keep Abimelech from being with Sarah in a way that he shouldn't. All right. Verse 7. So God says, I know your heart was right. I have also kept you from this woman. Verse 7. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. Would you really want this prophet to pray for you? We don't want hugs from people we don't like. Do you really want someone to come up and say, I'm praying for you if you don't like that person? Or if you know a significant failure in their life? And yet here God makes it very clear, this is my man, this is my prophet, I'm going to deal with him. You need to give him back what is his, even though he lied to you, and he will pray for you. And his prayer will have an effect. What kind of effect will that be? You will live. But if not, you will surely die, and everyone that is yours. So here we have an evidence of God imposing his will to keep Abimelech from Sarah, and yet he is giving room for Abimelech to exercise his free will. You have a choice to make. You give this woman back, and the man will pray for you, and I will save you. But if you don't, here is what will befall you and everyone else that belongs to you. Verse 8. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning. And as one scholar noted, the way that these old texts are written, if someone got up early in the morning and it's put in the text, it was a way of showing if they were just told previously, do this thing, and they rose up early the next morning, that's another way of the writer telling us this person obeyed immediately. And we will see this is very important. We will see this in another chapter coming up. Someone else who gets up early in the morning and goes to obey right away. So to Abimelech's credit, he engages with God, and now he's going to choose to obey God. And if he truly is a pagan, then of course, what kind of conviction is that for us as believers? Do we obey God? Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, here's what he says, what hast thou done unto us? Because this is still on Abraham. This is one of those examples where Abimelech can stand back and say, I'm innocent. This is someone else who has sinned, but I still have to choose the right way to respond. And the right way to respond, the text makes it clear, is to give back the man's wife. Okay, and Abimelech's going to do that, and yet he still has a moment. God allows Abimelech to have a moment where Abraham will get reprimanded. This already happened in Egypt. Abraham gets reprimanded, and he will get reprimanded again by more than likely a pagan, right? What have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. What did I ever do to you, right? And Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? What did you see in me or in this land that would lead you to think we need to deceive this man and put him in a great deal of trouble? Because remember, Abimelech might not have known who God was at that time, but Abraham certainly knows who God is. As it's been mentioned, he's spoken with God. God has spoken with Abraham. He blessed Abraham when he went to defeat all of those armies to rescue Lot from Sodom. He's been given these promises. He's been taken care of time and time again. Why did Abraham not trust God again? Hey, remember that time we went to Egypt and we acted like you were my sister and we got reprimanded for that and God protected us and he's maintained this promise that he will give us an heir. He just met with us not long ago saying a year from now, you're going to have a child. We're going to have a child together. Why would he not protect us now? And of course, Abraham, being the human that he is, and all of us have been there, right? I know God is taking care of me here. I'm in a very similar situation now. I'm not going to trust God this time. What did you see? Here's Abraham's response. Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Well, if you were entering into a place where you knew that people didn't fear God, it's pretty reasonable to think that they would do just about anything and everything. As one gentleman put it a few years ago who works in the prison systems, he says a thing that all the guards would say to each other, the kind of joke they have amongst each other is, yeah, he's a good guy. Because they have to deal with all these criminals and they have to go into some pretty dangerous situations. Hey, he's a really good guy. Just don't leave him alone with your wife. Because most of them are godless. They can do these necessary jobs, put themselves in harm's way, but there's some moral lines that they don't mind crossing. So Abraham's thought of, we're entering into an evil place, a pagan place. Well, what will pagans do? They do whatever they want to do. They are their own masters. They set up their own boundaries. They don't care about real morality. So Abraham's thought it's not invalid. But he still should have trusted God. And keep in mind, watch what Abraham says here. And yet, indeed, she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father. So Abraham is falling back on a technicality. She is my sister. She's my half-sister. The loophole, right? Okay, even if she is your half-sister, Abraham, she's also your wife. And you left that detail out, right? And human beings are very good, and not even human beings. Because the father of lies is Satan himself. Satan is very good at crafting a story to make himself always look like the victim, to make himself always look like the one who's innocent, to make it look like this is the way that things should go. And Abraham here is answering Abimelech honestly and yet kind of hedging his response. Yeah, she is my sister, right? I thought it was an evil place. She is my sister. Abraham's still kind of crafting things to give himself an out. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house. And I think it's David Guzik or Matthew Henry who points out the word wander here in the Hebrew. Abraham makes a very damning accusation against God here. This is like Adam, when God confronts Adam in the garden and says, why did you commit this sin? And Adam's response is, because of the woman you gave me. And Abraham says, she's really my half-sister. One, I thought you guys were evil. I didn't know that I could trust you. Technically, she's my half-sister. Thirdly, God made me wander. The word wander here in the Hebrew means to go adrift, aimlessly. It is the Hebrew word that's used for someone who has no moral compass. Is that what God did to Abraham? God called him from a land, Ur of the Chaldees, to give him a land of his own. God has been very explicit in his promises, and even though there might be some uncertainty where that's going to be, God has still taken care of Abraham. The life of Abraham following God has not been the life of wandering adrift. But whenever Abraham chooses that which is right in his own eyes, that is when he starts to wander. That's when he starts to go adrift, and yet he wants to put all of it on God. Okay. When it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, this is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, he is my brother. And again, we explored this earlier in the chapter in Egypt, and other very good scholars have noted, Abraham wants Sarah to do this kindness for him, but how is that any kindness to her, his wife? Be taken into the houses of these men, and we'll see whatever they do to you, but that'll be to keep me alive. That's not what love does. That's certainly not what a spouse should do, right? The spouse should put the other spouse first, especially when we get in the New Testament, when men are told to love their wives as how? As Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He gave himself for the church. Now, Christ also corrects the church. That doesn't mean we men love our wives by, you're always right, we'll do whatever you say. That's not what he's saying, right? But it is, I love you more than I love myself. And I will do what I can to protect you and to make sure you're treated properly. It will not be always what I want, and let's make sure that I stay alive. This is a really bad moment for Abraham. And yet he's still a righteous man. He is still God's chosen. He's still God's prophet, which is just a good thing to remember, right? That is all, as long as we are on this side of the sun, even as believers, we will fail. Even our leaders will fail us. Even our righteous ones will fail us. Verse 14. So Abimelech is told to give Sarah back. Watch what Abimelech does. Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham and restored Sarah his wife. This is a bit of foreshadowing, some scholars have noted, of what's going to happen when the Jews are brought out of Egypt. They are let to go, and then they are spoiled. They're given all this extra stuff, right? Go, go, go. Be good to God's people, all right? Even though God's people don't always deserve it, right? And here's what Abimelech says. Watch what he says to Abraham and Sarah. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. So he's going to give Abraham land. Here's all these more material possessions, and I'm giving your wife back, and here's this land you can stay in. This will be important in the next chapter. And then here's what he says unto Sarah. Behold, I have given thy, and what does he call Abraham? Does he say, I've given your husband, or what does he call Abraham? Brother. Abimelech's being a little sarcastic, right? He's called them out. And he will not judge them more than is right. He has put the truth before them because it's been revealed to him by God. And yet ultimately it's up to God to deal with these two, even his chosen. And he says, behold, I've given your brother, right? Okay. I've given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee and with all other. Thus she was reproved. Sarah was reproved. Abraham's been reproved. It's another important thing here, a beautiful thing about the spousal relationship. As Christ will say, if you look on another woman and lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. Even in the thoughts and intents of our heart, those things can happen. And Abimelech puts up, this is pretty amazing as a pagan, what he thinks about marriage. I would never take another man's wife, even if I have the power and authority to, or I could do things in a legal way. I'm not going to take another man's wife. And a man to his wife is like a covering to her. I must respect that relationship. Abimelech needs a social media account today. Look what he says about marriage. Man, be respectful of the woman out of respect for their connection with the man and vice versa. Even if they're not great. Verse 17. So Abraham prayed unto God. The prophet has been reproved. He goes to pray for God. How many of us in here would want to pray for someone who's called us out? To be good to God's anointed and God's chosen is not an easy accomplishment. For outside of Jesus Christ, even the followers of God are imperfect. So we, for example, as a congregation, have to show mercy to our leaders within reason, right? And the leader, I'm sure, is showing mercy to us within reason. And on a larger scale, even to the Jewish nation. Not that they can't be wrong. The Old Testament is full of God judging his people from an individual scale, like with Abraham, to the national scale. And I've heard plenty of times growing up that the God of the Old Testament is the God of the law. And he is, right? He's that angry God. I'm seeing a lot of law and mercy and grace still. Why is that important? Because the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New. He's not different. Might work in a slightly different way, as Pastor was showing us in Hebrews, right? He's spoken to us by prophets and angels, and now he's given us his Son, but it is still the same God who has a place for law, mercy, and grace. And it is difficult for those who needs God to pray for those who needs God's mercy, even when they've rightly chastised us for our sin. It requires a contrition and a faith before God that exceeds human wisdom. Because that's not what human wisdom tells us to do. Human wisdom says, you save face. You get yours. You're the hero of the story. And Scripture says the story is God's story. We are players on a stage who play a significant part, but we are not the heroes. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. Probably means that Sarah had stayed with Abimelech long enough to know that babies weren't being born. Like, hey, no one's getting pregnant. What's going on? They were there a while. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. If there's anything Scripture's making very clear to us, all the things the Old Testament is drawing out to us, regardless of how humans behave, God sees marriage as something very important, and the life of the human being is very important as well. If children aren't being born, what does that mean for a people? They're not going to be around much longer. If we have no respect for a marriage, what does that mean for us as a people? But even at the individual level, right? God is showing us here too that even the pagan must be dealt with properly. We can have a valid thought that we wrongfully apply, right? Abraham had this thought about the pagan, but he applied it in an incorrect way, right? And we see that the will and the mercy of God is still working through all this. And so he does as he said he would do. You get back this woman, the prophet will pray for you, and you will live. And Abimelech and him do, and they're now able to have children, and that group will be able to live. And we go right into chapter 21, which we'll look at next week. Just this one verse alone we'll read, but we'll talk about it next week. Just this one verse alone is worth thinking about. And the Lord visited Sarah as he said. And the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. That verse alone is, man, that's a beautiful verse. And we'll come back next week, all right? Thank you.